Before we head in, let's get back into understanding how layers work here with our software. This is pretty much reminiscent of what we experience traditionally, but it's important to get a grasp on how it works on both ways, traditionally and digitally. Now, layers basically are your paper or surface where we can draw on. For the timeline, it would look like this over here. Let's describe as frames as where the layers would be placed or the space it will be occupying. When it comes to animating on Clip Studio, we basically have designated folders for animating to make adding layers or drawn frames much easier. Compared to a normal or adding layers here without or just with an ordinary folder. Because if we also use just regular folders or layers, it will occupy the whole space we have here on the timeline. With an ordinary folder, all of the layers can still be visible because of it. But with the animation folder, we can only see a frame or a drawing, depending where we are located at the timeline, and it is basically contains the whole sequence within it. The animation folder is where our keyframes, in-betweens, and basically all of the images we have would be placed in. In the traditional medium, similar concepts follow. Each drawn frame is in one paper and followed by another to build up a sequence or a scene. Now let's head in when it comes to in-betweening. Animation is all about travel and movement, something going from A to B, but with that, the middle is left empty and serves as a gap between the points. And in order to make the movement and travel visible, we fill those gaps with in-between. In-between is basically the drawing that sits beside the previous drawn frames and the next following frame. It's also the drawings and frames that help smoothen the animation. I consider in-betweening one of the section of the process that is extremely time consuming, mainly because of the quantity you need to produce in order to complete the motion and to refine your animation. I also consider it one of the section that really completes it all together. Quite a meticulous process, yet it's the one that really brings life to your animation. It can contribute a lot when it comes to the visual interpretation of speed and weight. But first, let's get to know the tools we need to draw an in between. As we discussed earlier from the lectures, you can feel free to apply and plan ahead using the timing chart. But now let's dive deeper with a function called onion skin. Now, the onion skin basically is a function in Clip Studio Paint and usually to other animation software that is. And what it actually does is basically show the previous drawing and the preceding frame while we're in the frame for the in-between. It's as basic and frank as it is. It gives us a visual guide to either trace or draw the frame in between. You can change the color of how your previous frame and next frame would look also. To change that, you can see that on the preference menu and you can also set up the opacity for it also. Mine is just set up as red and blue. Blue being the previous frame and the red one would be the next frame. Their opacity is also set up somewhere lower, so they're somewhat transparent. And just something not to get confused about when drawing the in-between. You can only see the onion skin to the selected layer, or the animation folder you're in. If there are other layers within another animation folder, the onion skin for that one won't appear unless you're currently in use of that layer, or in that layer. Now, to draw the in-between using the onion skin, you basically just look at the guides and just base around those that are appearing on the screen in order to fill in the gaps of your animation. If you are using a timing chart or wondering what frame to favor, simply just base of the colors that you would be referring to. As we just discussed previously, if the in-between that we are working on and the spacing is much closer, let's say to the next frame, then we just simply base to draw more or leaning more onto that next frame instead of the previous one. But if you're leaning more onto the previous frame, then you would just simply draw more closer to it and refer it to much more compared to the other. The onion skin function is quite simple for filling in gaps, and seeing the next and previous frame, it's very frank. But in my perspective and experience, it's quite a lacking tool. It's very simple, especially when it comes to tracing. Now, tracing is quite crucial in order to be more consistent with your drawings, and just mainly a part of the process. Tracing is also helpful because in animation, and when you're already dealing with slower motion, frames tend to repeat with very little change to them. And in order to reproduce those frames, we either copy it or trace it. The in-between process actually contains a lot of tracing to do. And their appearance can rather be often heavily skewed, rather than what you usually see on polished illustrations or keyframes. The drawings would often look more skewed or disarranged. Mainly it functions more as a frame to polish the movement. This also applies on real life also. If you pause a bit randomly on the middle of something, you would notice the frame really doesn't look all that pleasing. Oftentimes it'll look blurred. Clip Studio has another great tool dedicated to animation, and it's called the Lightbox. In the onion skin function, you don't get to choose what frames you'll be referring to. It just mainly displays the next and previous frames. But the Lightbox is much more flexible than the onion skin. Traditional animation make use of this tool prominently. You get to choose what frame to look at to and which one to trace. When using the Lightbox function, I mainly sit on the frame I'll be drawing, then drag and drop a frame where I'll be basing out of. I can adjust the opacity and use the operation tool to rotate, drag, and position it whenever I like, and to my convenience. I can still enable the onion skin while the lightbox is enabled, or when making use of it. But I tend to turn it off so I can just focus on what I inserted. But you can also add in more frames to put on the lightbox, unlike the onion skin. But let me also introduce you to a method when creating in-betweens that doesn't rely on both. This demands more skill and pertaining more onto your memory, although this is quite helpful to not completely disorient your drawings and figures way too much, and to keep yourself consistent. Because when you rely onto tracing completely, your figures would be more exposed to look more disoriented and completely out of its base design. This method just mainly relies on to go back and forth to your frames, switching back and forth while you put in the lines to fill in the gaps. I basically go to the next frame to look at it and then go back to put in and draw a line to the in-between and then repeat the process until I finish the drawing. Same process goes when I'm basing out of the previous frame. I really don't exactly recommend this for beginners, but I do recommend to try this one out. I tend to not rely too much to onion skin for it sometimes. I just find it distracting and often lose myself to the process, while not taking into notice that it's affecting the motion of the animation, while losing consistency of the scale and the figure I'm drawing. I also want to mention the vector tools available on the program. Although I only use this rarely, the function that it offers is quite helpful. Vector layers can be used instead of raster. Vectors usually don't lose their quality, no matter how much you transform them, unlike to raster layers, where it can butcher and lose its quality after numerous transformations. There are tools where it enables you to transform a certain line stroke. This can be helpful for in-betweening, especially when dealing with complicated design and details. But I'll be using the raster layers and frames overall throughout the whole lecture. For drawing the frames is where I'm much more comfortable to work with. Now that we get to know the tools that we can use on in-betweening, let's head in to get back to on how to manipulate the speed and weight of your animations by using in-betweens. I want to recall the mechanics of favoring frames. We do know that the more in-betweens or drawings, the more slower the animation can get. In order to depict faster motion, you would require less drawn frames going from A to B. The transition is much faster, also due to their wide spacing apart from each other, compared to the close spacing of slower pace motion, while also applying or holding frames. Ones and twos for indicating faster motion, then we have holding the animation by threes or fours for slower motion. Now, to combine those, since the motion or action can't be all fast the whole time, nor can be all slow the whole time, for that, it would just make it static. There should be a clear indication of starting and ending of an action, or I'll be calling it anticipation and easing. This is like the tempo of an action. It's all about momentum, gaining and losing, as I would say. Anticipation is the indication of starting to move or gain momentum, and easing is all about ending the move or just basically losing momentum. It's pretty much like rising action and falling action. Now, the reason for getting to know how to animate a variety of speed is mainly because this is a helpful way to indicate the weight of a figure. We can have this cube as an example. Let's have an arc for in terms of physics. This is the usual direction or flow of what a bouncing object would go through. In this way, we'll have a guide of what direction it's going to. Now, you would notice that the graph, or as I would call our timing chart, and points of indicating the position or spacing of the frames. The placement would again be useful of indicating what and which sections are going fast and slow from beginning to end. The beginning section over here has more frames, therefore would be a much more slower phase. Heavyweight objects tend to be much harder to lift, so going upwards would tend to look slower. At its peak, it tend to be much slower compared to how it started, and then transitions to a much more faster pace when falling down. This is because again we're basing out of its weight. Heavy objects are hard to lift, but tend to be faster and easier to fall compared to light-weighted objects. So the flow can be summarized as from slow beginning, going slower or to a stop, then fast again, then easing to slow and stop. You may notice something with the shape if you check each frame. There are some changes to its form to certain parts. Some are relatively more longer and somewhat squashed. It's important to keep it consistent when it comes to forms. As you can see, I tried to keep the cube its form, and with respect to its perspective or angle it's in. It comes from an angle that is much smaller and upwards, then transitions to somewhere going downwards, and it sort of ends like in the 3/4 angle. I've used some stretches and squashing to certain frames, also as an in-between. The shape stretches and elongates when going downwards. The reason for this application, as I mentioned earlier, faster movement requires less frames. And to make sure to fill in the gaps and to smoothen it out, I had to stretch it out. For the compressed or somewhat squashed figure, this is just something I've done to indicate its landing and its collision from the ground. The figure is basically in this downward momentum, and it only comes to a stop when colliding to something that negates that direction, making it look squashed and forms this somewhat bouncy motion, for it redirects the direction mainly because of that contact. You don't have to do it too much. Sometimes I only do it a tiny bit. The only time I tend to exaggerate is when the motion is quite fast, so it tends to not look too obvious or that noticeable, since the transition and motion is fast for the eye to keep track of. But let me actually show you other ways to distort the figure for the sake of the motion. Is someone applies the squash and stretch concept, but it's much more constructed by relying on the smears or motion blurs. Smear frames are a fantastic tool for repetitive motion or fast actions. There's no exact rule to draw them in a way. It is a matter of distorting the image and figure after all. Smear frames is sort of like an animation hack. Also, it's all about creating the illusion of movement. It only flashes on the screen really quickly and barely noticeable to the eye. That's why the distortion of its shape and figure is so extreme. Smear frames is not all about aesthetic nor accuracy. Again, it's all about the movement and is a tool for their movement. I tend to make use of smear frames for fast and back and forth motions from time to time on my animations. This technique exists mainly for the phenomenon that happens in real life. You can try to wave your hand really fast and you can pretty much see the motion blur that it's creating. Smear frames is basically that, but applied in animation. Now let me introduce various ways to depict smear frames. If you watch videos and such, you can see an example of a smear frame. When something is blurred and pretty much why it's called a smear frame, for the figure appeared to be smeared, stretched, and distorted mainly because of the motion. The example earlier where the frame or figure is depicted stretch compared to its original shape can be considered as a smear frame. But let me actually introduce you to other ways to depict such frames. There are other ways that you can draw this. The first type that I like to call is mainly using action lines. We also call them speed lines, or perhaps motion lines. You can basically refer it to whichever you'd like it to be. Now, this technique makes use of dashes or multiple line strokes to indicate that something is moving in a certain way or in a certain direction. If I draw the line vertically and I put the lines back here, it would kind of show or depict somewhere going to a direction going upwards. But if the lines are like up here, then the figure would basically look like it's going downwards. And the same principle basically applies when going horizontally. And if it's in a curved direction, the line would also be curved as so. It's important to keep in mind of the direction and placing these lines, because if you only place them randomly, it would appear rather incohesive of where it's going, and just tends to look much more shaky. Now, when talking about how to draw them exactly and how would they look, I mainly just recommend to have variety to its length. I don't recommend on making it so uniform, and I find it inefficient anyways. It's better to have some variety to it and somewhat of a flow. We do have to take note and remember, these frames would only be flashed for barely a second, and that's basically barely noticeable to be seen. So don't point and push to be tedious on these parts. We do require to be efficient when it comes to time and progress. Now, what I basically do, I really just tend to draw these lines somewhat looking pointed, so it would look and quite reminiscent of what a stretch frame or figure would look, but just a bit much more pointed on its tail part. The shape could also be completely unrecognizable from its original design, just composed with speed lines for the sole purpose of looking like it's in motion. You'll probably see this technique and examples applied to a lot of action mangas or comics in particular. For unlike in animation where the characters can see or you can see them move, in this manga or comics, they are completely still. There are illustrations after all. So a way to the artist that can show and depict that these characters are moving, they use or utilize speed or action lines to produce this sort of strike and motion to a completely still picture or illustration. A simple motion blur could also help out. You can also add it into your drawn smears already, but it's important to note that the motion blur should be in accordance or in the same direction as the smears or the frames drawn. There's also a feature in Clip Studio Paint where you can blur your image to a certain direction, making it appear like a motion blur and give it this illusion as if it was moving. although I rarely add this on my animation, but regardless, helpful to have nonetheless. And again, I want to keep note of the direction. For randomly blurring it out would make it somewhat incoherent and disorient the direction of flow of your animation. Now, for the next thing about smear frames, you can also try out on multiplying the drawings of your figures. The way to draw this is basically having the actual figure, the way it's drawn, much more solid and complete, while the other following ones are much more simplified and looked stretched and faded. You can also make it appear like they're merging all together. You can also try out to make it look like it's only fading, and only a few lines or colors indicating of its presence. You can also lower its opacity also to give it a much more faded look. Again, this is all up to you and pretty much optional. Again, to take note of, smear frames are just has this basic purpose and should only at least to be followed by a drawing that shifts back to its original form. Again, smear frames are just designated for the sake of motion exclusively. I think it's also important to take note of to have these dedicated frames or drawings where the distortion is somewhat gradually decreasing when the figure is setting into a stop or going back to its original form. Let me describe this. You have a smear frame where the figure is heavily distorted, and when transitioning and settling to another pose, you would have a faint look of a smear frame or blur, then have the original form or figure once again. This is basically your indication of a gradual decrease of movement, but this could also only apply for gradual increasing speed but backwards. Now, when it comes to back and forth motion, smear frames in particular are pretty much your best tool or asset to have to make use of it here. An example of a repetitive motion would be a spinning action. And as you can see, the frames are just pretty much repeating itself. And it's pretty much in an endless loop or a cycle. What you see is the repetitive aspect gives this illusion of the figure shifting multiple times. I kind of call this like smear cycles. Smears for referring to smear frames, and cycles referring to looped or repeating action. This is pretty much a static motion because there's no gradual decrease or increase of action or speed, and it's pretty much consistent with its speed overall. You won't be needing to decrease the distortion of the figure and instead put it into a continuous cycle or a certain repeating pattern. As you can see, you would only need a few dedicated frames to create a loop animation. This pretty much saves up time also when regarding to its process. You pretty much all you need is like 3 or 4 frames, or a variety of frames is pretty much good enough for a loop or a repeating pattern. This probably requires us to copy and paste some frames on the timeline, and in order to do that, it's quite different here on Clip Studio Paint. We basically can't use the simple select, click, or control C and V, or using a shortcut key for this. And since we're like dealing with animation that tends to go back and forth motion, we could just simply reuse some drawn frames already. I use repeating frames on certain situations, like indicating a twitching motion or just some action that repeats basically. Now, in this software, we could just simply do this by assigning our frames to play once again. And we can do that through looking at our timeline, then copy paste our selected section that we want to repeat. And then again, I have to remind you, when copying and pasting some frames to repeat some motion, a simple shortcut key won't work on Clip Studio. So we'd have to like go into the menu in order to copy and paste it. Now, in the timeline here, you can separate or split a clip to have its own designated group, and makes it much more easier for us to see what section would be different from the shot or would contain a repeating motion. We select a section here after splitting them, and then just go and right click and select phase, since we can also move it around the timeline just by holding it on this bar, then to whether extend or move it into a certain time for it to play. Smear frames are just basically a fun way on making the workload less of a burden, especially for fast action. It makes the motion or movement more natural and understandable, and you don't even need to worry about the accuracies and stuff. But despite all the methods I've shown you, it's still hard to tell if there are any rules here. You can literally and pretty much do anything to distort your figures to however you like it to be, and in regards to the direction of movement you like. Smear frames pretty much only tends to rely on the direction of where it's going, and after that, how that will be drawn or pictured is all up to you, and that's pretty much how I sum it up. But I do want to remind the sole purpose of the smear frames. It's to serve as a bridge between two frames. It is an in-between after all, and that is what in-betweens are meant for. In-betweens are all about smoothing and filling in the gaps of the motion, indicate the speed and weight of the animation. And that's all for today when it comes to in-betweens. I was only able to show you various ways to draw an in-between and how you can apply various ways to depict a certain motion. But in the next lecture, I'll be touching more about the tools and software that I've used, as I give you a detour around Clip Studio Paint and how I managed to work with it. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. Thank you so much and hope to see you on the next one.